So I'm going to tell you today about, as Tamara said, a more kind of social science perspective on some of the work that we do here in COMET. So talking about the role of qualitative data in seismic risk analysis. And before I start, I'd just like to mention that the study that I'm being mostly presenting today is currently in review. So if people have questions, comments, or points of information about it, then I'd be really happy to hear those, because it would be great to have feedback, and there's plenty of time for incorporating that. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors on this project, who are all postdocs in different departments at the University of Cambridge, without whom this would definitely not have happened, and also I would not have learned nearly as much about how to do social sciences, as it were, as I have over the last year. I'm also going to be presenting the results of a workshop that we conducted, so I'd like to thank all of the people who participated in that, who shared their time and ideas with us. And crucially, that workshop and the participants in it came out of two groups in Cambridge, the Cambridge Disaster Research Network and the Cambridge Infrastructure Resilience Group. And they've been the source of a lot of interesting conversations over the last few years. So I'd like to thank those people as well. In terms of situating this talk within the kind of COMET series and kind of thinking about where this comes from, I'd like to suggest that you go and watch Ruth Amy's COMET webinar, which she gave last month, as a sort of prequel to this talk. I appreciate you can't do that in real time, but if any of this doesn't make sense or needs more background, then Ruth provided a really nice outline of how we kind of conventionally, I suppose, and currently do seismic hazard and risk estimate based on more geophysical parameters. But what I'm going to be talking about today then is kind of an extension of that, and how we think about risk into, I suppose, some more imagined territories. So let's start by coming back to basics and just thinking about what we mean when we talk about disasters and hazards. So if we look at the UN disaster risk reduction definitions of a hazard is a process, phenomenon, or human activity that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, etc. And what that means is that hazards are potentially, though not always, natural. They include things like earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, which would happen whether or not people and societies were there to experience them. A disaster, on the other hand, constitutes a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or society, and requires that such a hazardous event interacts with conditions of exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. And I'm not going to go into the detailed definitions of what these concepts mean today. There's a whole social science literature around that. But what it does mean, crucially, is that disasters are not natural. And that might seem obvious to some of us as earthquake scientists. So I can imagine that many of you get USGS earthquake alerts, and you will have noted that when you see that there's a magnitude 6 earthquake somewhere in the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, you're not overly worried about what the impacts of that are likely to be. And that was nicely summarized by Hewitt in his 1997 book, where he's just given a list here of some moderate magnitude earthquakes which occurred throughout the 20th century, purely to illustrate that the magnitude of the event doesn't correlate with the losses, either in terms of deaths or in terms of the financial impacts of an earthquake. And if we think then a bit more globally about this, we can see that something a little more complex is happening, right? This isn't quite as simple as recognizing that where earthquakes interact with societies, they form disasters, and where they don't, there are no disasters. If we look at a plot of the deaths and costs in billions of 2005 dollars of a variety of events, this figure is from Billum in 2009, but I've updated it with a couple of earthquakes that have happened since. What we can see is that there's kind of two clusters here, right? We have earthquakes that are extremely expensive and don't kill terribly many people. And then we have earthquakes which kill an awful lot of people and don't cost very much in 2005 dollars, though relative to the GDPs of those countries, the cost can be enormous. So the Haiti earthquake, for example, cost around $7 billion 2005 dollars, but that represented 130% of Haiti's GDP at the time. So it's still a really significant financial impact there. And so this suggests that there's something deeper going on than purely the question of where earthquakes interact with people, that being a disaster. And that we need to kind of interrogate a bit more what it is that's underlying the causes of disasters actually happening. And we can also see this on a more local scale. So this is a table of deaths from the 1993 Maharashtra earthquake, where it's subdivided by the sex of those who died. And what you can see if we look at this line in the table, which is showing the percentage of deaths in a particular age category, is that in almost all age categories, women represented more than 60% of the deaths. And we can get some more insight into why this is if we look at where most men died, or the age of most men who died, and those were the under 14-year-olds. And the reasons behind this are essentially that earthquake occurred in the middle of the day, and at a time when it was expected that women and young children would be in the home, and so people were killed in their houses, and that represented a gendered variation in the death toll. And it must be said that this doesn't always go in the sense of women dying. The 1974 Cretan earthquake, for example, occurred where many men were in the mosque, and so that led to more men dying. But what that shows us really is that what's governing the number of deaths and the losses in these earthquakes is not so much the magnitude of the earthquake or the shaking itself, but the underlying social and economic structures which are in place at the time when it occurs. So why does this matter? It's quite easy, I think, for us as earthquake scientists, as earth scientists, to kind of dismiss the idea that there are no natural disasters as an unimportant nuance of terminology. But I think it really matters if we consider that we're bringing people up in a world where it's constantly repeated that disasters are natural, right? That one might expect that when an earthquake occurs, a disaster will happen. And in that sense, they're being depicted as effectively acts of God, as something which could be excluded from the normal and which is, in a sense, unmitigable. And I think this was summarized really nicely by O'Keefe, Westgate, and Wisner in 1976 paper, where they said that it's that in order for us to really plan for disasters, we need to consider the vulnerability of population as the real cause of disaster. And crucially, that vulnerability can be modified by man and is not just an act of God, that we need to take responsibility before we move on and work out how we can actually do these things. And to think about this as a geophysicist, I think it means that we have responsibility for how our science is used, but also that we need to consider the particular perspective that we're engaging with when we think about creating something like a hazard map. And crucially for this talk, what the implication of this is that any study of disasters, hazard, and disaster risk needs to be interdisciplinary. We can't just operate as physicists on our own. It also matters because I think this is just I wanted to demonstrate to you that these kind of ideas are really co-opted by governments to absolve themselves of responsibility for preparation for a crisis. So some of these headlines may be familiar to some of you. They're all taken from various newspapers over the last year in the course of the COVID pandemic. And of course, unprecedented itself as a word doesn't actually imply that it was unplannable for or impossible to mitigate in advance. But that is the way in which this term is being used, right? Is the idea that because something has no historical precedent, there is no way that we could have done or known anything about it, which when I was talking to the Disaster Research Network about this, the epidemiologists in the room certainly disagreed with. So this brings us to a broader question about how we plan for disaster risk in the future, which is the issue of extrapolating the historical record. And we can think about this purely in the context of hazards. This is an issue that many of you will be familiar with, that, as we well know, for earthquakes, the instrumental record about the past 60 years is a lot shorter than the time between earthquakes, which might be geological, if indeed they have repeat times, as Tamara can discuss more in detail. But what that means is that we want to extend that instrumental record into the historical record. That historical record, even in the best recorded places, is perhaps a few thousand years long, and so in that case, incomplete. And what that leads to is maps like this one from Pakistan in 2006, where what you can see is that we have these kind of bullseyes of high hazard in the areas which have had recent earthquakes. So there's one near Islamabad, which corresponds to the 2005 Muzaffarabad earthquake and also the 1974 Patan earthquake. We've got one near Quetta from 1935, Bhuj 2001, Gwadar 1945, etc. And so what this tells us is that we're not really learning about this map from a geological perspective, right? It's just informed by what's happened in the historical record. And Bilam nicely summarized the problems with doing this. More recently, there has been a trend, and Ruth spoke nicely about this in her webinar, towards thinking about what the geological record tells us. So that's both in terms of paleoseismology, but then incorporating that further into probabilistic seismic hazard models, and also thinking about what we think of as possible beyond only what's probable, but also like investigating deterministic scenarios. So potential one-off major events that might have impact that we can't otherwise account for. But the other problem that we encounter is that how we interpret that historical or paleoseismological record is informed by our current understanding of what is physically possible. And a nice example of this comes from the Tohoku earthquake in 2011. So on the left here, this figure shows a plot of the magnitude of earthquakes at different subduction zones based on the age of the subducting slab and also the convergence rate at that subduction zone. And this is what was known in 1980. And there was some basis for thinking that there was a correlation between the age of a subduction zone and a fast convergence rate and the magnitude. So rapid subduction in young subduction zones led to big earthquakes, and you couldn't have large magnitude earthquakes at the slower, older subduction zones. If we look then at an updated figure from 2011 and the Tohoku earthquake, what we can see is that when we've got this additional data, that we can begin to realize that actually these magnitude 9 earthquakes can happen anywhere. This correlation was spurious and partly based on the idea that there was an insufficient record really to understand this. But also there was data, for example, from the 869 earthquake in Japan, that there might have been tsunami deposits corresponding to an earthquake of similar magnitude to that in Tohoku. But the value of that information was under recognized simply because that wasn't within our kind of remit of physical understanding at the time. So how we interpret these historical records is also problematic and informed by our current understanding. And what this kind of tells us is that we've got a lot of different types of uncertainty when we're building some of these models. And forgive me for the large amount of text on this slide, but I'll just walk you through them. So in geological sense, aleatory uncertainty will always be there. This is kind of randomness or non-stochastic processes. And so an example would be that if we have a fault plane where there's some kind of asperity at 10 or 20 kilometers depth, we're never going to know what the details of that rock surface are, such that we could know which the individual crystal that will break in the next earthquake will be. And similarly, there's now suggestions that the evolution of an earthquake rupture is not kind of deterministic in the sense of actually being knowable longer term, right? So there's some uncertainties that are not reducible that we can't do anything about, and that's fine. And then we have epistemic uncertainties. So these are factors that we know are outside our current models, and they're normally often called reducible, because if we understood more about the world around us, then we could do better at reducing these. And so this is the kind of thing that a lot of people in COMET might tend to work on. So thinking about things like unmapped faults with surface expression, right? So where we could know that there's a fault, but we don't currently know. And if we included it in our model would be better and it would be less uncertain. And so these kind of things are nice problems because you can work on them and you know you're making a difference in improving your model. Ontological uncertainties are ones which are unexpected given current models. And these are often referred to as black swans. So that was a term coined by Nicholas Taleb in 2007, and it's very popular in the kind of business and finance communities. Or also the kind of unknown unknowns, which is from a speech by Donald Rumsfeld in the early 2000s. And these really represent the things that take us by surprise, that come from left field. And in this case of Tohoku, that would be something like a multi-segment rupture on the Tohoku section of the Japan Trench, which was simply dismissed as not a possibility at the time. And this talk is primarily concerned with how we reduce the space of ontological uncertainty. So how we find these things that are missing from our models and our current understanding, and work out basically what can we do about them. So if all these problems come with the record of hazards, then disasters, where we can start to consider the interaction of those hazards with social and political systems, is even more complicated, right? So this has, I think, been nicely summed up really by Ewing and Signalakis, and they said that we need to learn from past disasters, but not plan for them. There's some nuance here, because at the same time as a specific social and political context means that the exact same disaster will never be repeated, we also have that issue with the term unprecedented that I showed you before, where the claim that something has not happened before enables us to claim that it was impossible to plan for. And so what that means is that what we need in terms of thinking about what risks there are, so what disasters might unfold in future, are, from the known natural hazards perspective, from the known natural disasters perspective, an interdisciplinary approach. We need to be working with social scientists to understand these problems. We also need an approach to developing scenarios which goes beyond the historical record for all the reasons that I've outlined, but also manages to recognize the social and economic causes of disasters and their complexities. And finally, we need to explore the possible, not only the probable, because many of the disasters that have called into question the value of our seismic hazard models and mapping in the last 20 years have really fallen into the section of kind of tail risks, things that are possible, but have a really low probability if we were to just account for them in that sense. And this is where the main subject of our talk today, my talk today, comes in. So I'm going to be talking about a method of risk analysis which has recently been proposed for kind of systematically developing scenarios. And specifically, it aims to look at these kind of high impact, low frequency disasters, so things like black swans, by starting from a historical disaster or starting from something that was nearly a disaster and considering how it might have been worse or how it might be worse if it happened in the future. And specifically, this technique is really interested in events which were as likely to have happened as what actually unfolded. And what that means is that they can help, this kind of method can help us to explore the space of things that were avoided by luck rather than by preparation, right? And so to give you an example and maybe make this method more clear, we could consider the 2015 earthquake in Nepal. We'd start from some known hazard event that actually happened. So the Gorkha earthquake. That earthquake happened on a Saturday, which in Nepal is the only day when schools are closed and most people are not at work. And so we can consider that a first downward shift might be to change the timing of that event to any other day of the week. And in the scheme of things, if you think about the recurrence time between earthquakes, variation to within a day of the week is essentially equally probable, right? So there was a 6 out of 7 chance that it might have happened on a day when the collapse of schools would have led to the deaths of thousands or hundreds of, or tens of thousands of children. And there's a quantifiable outcome here, which in a sense in which this is worse, right? The number of deaths would likely have been higher. But there's also an unquantifiable worsening associated with that, which is the psychological impact on a nation of the deaths of a significant proportion of its children. Second, we might think about the location of that earthquake. The earthquake happened in Gorkha, so just slightly to the west of Kathmandu. And had it been very slightly further east, it would have been a direct hit on the main capital city where the majority of the population is concentrated. So we consider again there that the death toll might have been significantly worse. The scale of the earthquake could have been higher. This was a blind rupture. It didn't come all the way to the surface, and many people have speculated about why that was. But you could also consider the possibility that the earthquake might have ruptured to the surface, in which case, again, we would have expected the losses to be worse. And all of these things are just, I suppose, luck of the hazard, right? And so it would be tempting to say, oh, Kathmandu was sufficiently prepared for it, or something like that, in terms of why the death tolls weren't as high as something that we had predicted for an earthquake in Nepal. But actually, if we think about this in terms of downward counterfactuals, then we can see that these are all just chance, that we've narrowly avoided all of these things. And then the final factor that we might think about is socio-political factors. At the time that this earthquake happened, Nepal had recently emerged from a period of Maoist insurgency, and if an earthquake had happened in that context, then there might well have been significantly more difficulties in delivering aid, as well as potential political and civil conflict ramifications for that earthquake. So this method has been applied a couple of times to the context of earthquakes. The first by Wu and Mignon in 2018, where they were thinking about the USURF parameter, which says that earthquakes that occur in those models aren't allowed to jump more than a certain gap, right? And they were thinking about the North Anatolian Fault, and what if it were the case that a rupture, rather than stopping at a termination in angle, actually was able to continue through that. And so that's an interesting way of speculating about what it means to have an earthquake that comes beyond our model, in the sense of not being something that's normally allowed in the models that we use to estimate hazard. And then the second from Lin et al. In 2020 is looking at an intraplate earthquake, and they're looking at moving the location of these earthquakes to exceed a certain peak ground acceleration in Singapore. Where does an earthquake have to happen in order for it to exceed the building codes in Singapore? And so both of these studies were quantitative, and they were mostly hazard-based. And they also narrowly circumscribed the range of possible changes that one can make in the scenario. However, when downward counterfactual analysis was initially proposed, there was an idea that it might be conducted sequentially around a table, rather as in a Victorian parlor game. And it seems to me, and was said by Kaplan in 1992, that the most important part of risk analysis is in fact considering what that range of scenarios is, which is inherently an imaginative exercise. Also, early reports suggest that the stories that people tell in conducting these kind of analyses are really an important component to try and capture. And so the aim of this study that I'm going to show you was really to see what we could do about incorporating qualitative information and how we could use a more qualitative approach to understanding and expanding the range of risks that we consider. I mentioned at the beginning the Cambridge Disaster Research Network. So this really came out of that group, which is something that I co-founded and convened in Cambridge at the moment. And the idea was that we have a lot of people who work on different aspects of disasters across the university, but there's no common forum for us to discuss things. So I kept meeting people from psychology, engineering, finance, etc., who worked on earthquakes, and we just didn't have a way of linking up. And so we've been running seminar series and trying to get together a bit of a group to do this stuff. And I should say also that we intend to connect the research that we do with practitioners as well. And that means that the network extends beyond the university, and anyone on this call would be very welcome to join us. But what it also means was that we had a kind of resource of a pool of interdisciplinary expertise, and we wanted to try this methodology and basically see what happened, because it hasn't really been done before, particularly in a workshop setting, or it hadn't been written up in a way that we could see. And so we wanted to explore what happened. And to do this, we needed a starting event. And so I'm not going to go into all the geophysics of this earthquake. There's a lot to be said, and it's super interesting, and I'm happy to talk more about it, though perhaps others on the call have worked more on it than I have. But essentially, in 365 CE, there was an earthquake offshore Crete. And we know this based on written reports, historical records, and also uplifted coastlines on Crete. And the best fitting fault plane for this earthquake indicates that it's a steeply drifting thrust. So it's actually not associated with the subduction interface in the Hellenic arc, but it's actually a splay fault. And that's important because the secondary effect of this earthquake was that it generated a tsunami, which spread around the Eastern Mediterranean. So reports of the tsunami come from the areas with the inverted triangles here. You can see they're right up into the Adriatic and as far across as the Nile Delta as well. And it's important that the splay fault is steeper than the subduction interface, because the gravitational potential energy goes like the sine of the dip. And so when you have a higher dip, then you get a higher height of wave. And so I think this is an interesting place to study, both from a kind of geological and tectonics perspective, because the Hellenic subduction zone is predominantly aseismic. And so it's an area, I think, where people are less aware of it being a subduction zone. At least that's what's suggested to me by it not being included in SLAB 1.0. And then also in terms of the populations, people are less aware of it being a subduction zone and the kind of hazards that represents. And secondly, it's interesting from the perspective of the socio-political and economic scenarios there. And particularly that if we think about updating this event to the present day, which is what we used as a starting scenario for our workshop, then we can see that we have these very high populations all around the Eastern Mediterranean. This population density is on a logarithmic scale. So we have as many as 10,000 people per square kilometre in some areas like the Nile Delta. And what that means is that there are a large number of people who would be exposed if such an event were to occur at the present day. So it's an important scenario to explore. Okay, so I mentioned that we conducted a workshop. We held it on Zoom on the 22nd of March this year for obvious reasons. Essentially, we assembled a group of 22 participants, mostly from, they were all from the Cambridge Disaster Research Network or the Infrastructure Resilience Group. Most of them were affiliated with Cambridge in some way, though not all of them. And they all worked on some aspect of disasters. So the word cloud here is just based on participants' responses to a question about what their discipline or area of research and interest were. And you can see most people are interested in risk, resilience, things related to disasters in some way. And the other thing to note is that the participants were mostly postdocs, though we also had some faculty, PhD students, and people outside academia as well. So what did we do? So we started, as I've mentioned, with this event. So we said that we've got the 365 CE earthquake, but it's happening now at the present day. And what we said was that you should, in each go, a person in the group would make a turn. And the turn that they propose, so this is some kind of change to that scenario, which makes the event worse. And the definition of worse varied between the times we did this. So in the first round, their change should make the event worse in the sense of leading to more casualties. In the second round, that it should make the event worse in the sense of leading to greater financial losses. And in the third round, that it was up to the participants themselves, and we were kind of encouraging them to explore aspects of the scenario that hadn't previously been interrogated in the previous two rounds. Importantly, the other aim was that we should keep the likelihood of the event happening as close to as possible, or as possible to the original event or higher. And this relates to the idea that the aim of downward counterfactuals is kind of to explore the space of ontological uncertainty, which sits just adjacent to our model. So what are the things that we could have planned for, but are just outside what we're thinking about, rather than things that are really totally out of the blue completely. And we were only interested really in worst case scenarios, but worst case scenarios where there was similar probability to what we had in the original scenario, or alternatively, then each round would stop at a particular time limit. So in each case, someone would propose a turn, say that they were going to change the disaster in a particular way. Then they would identify that turn with being a certain type. So I'll talk more about that later, but specifying what it was about the disaster they were changing. And then they would justify it, both in terms of being worse and in terms of how it was plausible, how it still kept the likelihood of the event reasonable. Then the rest of the group would discuss the turn, and they would either decide that that turn was okay, in which case you carry on. In which case you check whether you've reached what you think of as a worst case scenario, or you check if you've run out of time. And if you haven't, then the next person goes. And if the turn's rejected, then the next person just goes anyway. As it turns out, this, I suppose, is a physicist's view of how this might happen, and it was much more messy and complicated than that in reality. But that's something that I'd be happy to talk more about. And this was the kind of framework that we used for conducting the analysis, for conducting the discussion. And the hypothesis, and I've subsequently come to think of this as naive, but perhaps it won't seem so if I present it like this, which is that the more frequently repeated turns represent more likely scenarios. And this is something that has been talked about in the context of scenario planning elsewhere. The idea that basically, if every group doing an analysis on the casualties round, for example, comes up with the same thing happening, that might be a more likely thing to occur, or it might be something that we need to focus more attention on as an idea. And so I'll come back to that later on. Just to give you a sense of what we did with the data, and I appreciate that most people on this call are probably physical scientists, so I'll try and explain it properly, is that to start with, we needed to transcribe the recording. So we'd recorded it on Zoom, and we did automatic transcription using Otter.ai, but then that had to be manually checked by each convener because you get discrepancies between what the software comes up with, and also it sometimes inserts punctuation, which changes the nuance of what people have said and things like that. So each of the people who had run a group then went through and manually checked what they had done. And then we developed a code book. And when I talk about coding here, what I mean is going through a transcript like the one that's shown here and tagging the different parts of it by what people are talking about. So in this case, someone is saying that rumors spread in the States that this whole quake and tsunami was just fake news. And so that's been tagged as communication because the issue there is communication. But then they also say that leads to the US not participating in relief efforts. So that relates to the availability of funding. And we also have different kinds of themes, and I'll explore these more in a moment, but people being unsure of whether what they're contributing is actually accurate or whether they would like to check that someone should look into it more. But crucially, what I don't mean is pieces of Fortran or Python. When I talk about coding here, I'm talking about this tagging process. So what we wanted to do was develop a list of possible themes and codes, and then we could apply those to the transcripts that we had. So we had inductive components, which is where you start from your transcript and what everyone has said, and you kind of draw out the themes based on that. And we also had some deductive components, which I'll talk about in a minute, which is where you say, I'm interested in where the following themes come up, and then you go through and check where those themes have come up specifically. So we developed this code book, and then we went through and coded the transcripts, and each of the rounds was coded by at least 2 of the conveners. And you can imagine that one of the issues there is that people think that different stuff is about different topics. And so you want to be able to compare between the people who have done this. And that's quite difficult for a few reasons. One being that it's kind of blockers versus splitters idea, which is that some people will code whole paragraphs as being related to one thing, whereas other people will only code the relevant sentence. And that means that if you do some kind of automatic comparison, it doesn't always demonstrate really the level of agreement. And the other is coding density. So we've got a lot of different codes that we could be applying, and some people will apply loads of them, and some people will apply none or very few. And so the way that we got around this was by doing a manual comparison where basically 3 of us spent a long time going through each of the turns and just checking that we agreed about where someone had made a turn and what type of turn it was, and then the things that were associated with it. So I mentioned that we used deductive coding, and that was specifically around this issue of turn types. So we asked people both to declare what the turn that they'd made was and to say where it fitted in. And this was because we were interested in basically in what ways people chose to evolve the scenario. And we had 2 different sets of ideas for this. So one was from the original paper kind of proposing a more strategic methodology for doing downward counterfactual analysis, where they had proposed specific turn types. And so we gave the participants this as a cue card. The exception is directionality, which I added in because being a geophysicist, I guess I thought that directionality might become important and was something that we should be interested in. And then the other set of much more general turn types come from Arup's foresight team. So this was like sociocultural, technological, economic, environmental, or political. And we were kind of interested also in the comparison between using these broad turn types versus the more detailed ones from Lin et al. In 2020. And I'm not going to talk that much about that comparison today in the interest of time, but I'm happy to talk about it more another time if that's interesting to people. Then in terms of inductive coding, so this idea where we read our transcripts and then we use those to work out what people were talking about. We had kind of 3 broad categories. So one was the themes of the discussion. So this is literally just what were people talking about, particularly as relates to the scenario. Things like critical infrastructure, other natural hazards, tourism, warning systems, refugees. And so we developed lots of categories around that. Then the second was, how did people actually justify the turns that they had made? So when we asked people to say that their turn was worse, and when they said that it was plausible, what methods did they use to do that? And the main one here, I should say these are sized by how frequently they came up, was case studies, and that's something I'll talk a bit more about later. But people also spoke about their disciplinary expertise, their lived experience. And a lot of people said that things were outside their area of expertise and that they kind of hypothesized them, but that someone else should look into them later. And then finally, the last set of things was about methodology. And so this was either where we literally had people expressing their views on the methodology, so saying, you know, I think downward counterfactuals are a great idea, or otherwise. But it was also where there were complexities that arose, for example, it being difficult to tell whether someone was making a turn in the sense of actually proposing a change in how the disaster unfolded, or whether they were in fact just talking about the consequences of a turn that had happened before. So this kind of category was used for things like that. Okay, so that's what we did. And now I'm going to talk a bit about what we came up with as a result. So for each of the conveners in each of the rounds, we came up with a diagram like this. And I appreciate that this diagram is perhaps not super intuitive, so I'll just talk you through it. So this is an example from the financial round. And what we've got here is the turns that were taken, numbered by which order they happened in. And what we've really tried to separate out is turns which are independent of each other, that is to say, don't build on a previous turn, from turns which carry on from one that's happened before. So if we think about the beginning of this round, someone has proposed that this disaster would be worse in terms of the financial impacts if there was loss of infrastructure. And there's a note here that says that there was some question about whether loss of infrastructure is an outcome that we expect to see anyway, or whether there's something that this really constitutes a turn or not. And the second turn really doesn't follow on from that at all. This second turn is the idea that there might be rumors on social media that billionaires have been reported killed, and that this leads to disruption in the stock market, right? That would lead to greater financial losses. And what you can see below each of these turns is also this series of boxes. And so on the left 3 boxes correspond to the turn types under the Lin et al. Classifications. And then the patterns on the right-hand 3 boxes correspond to these Arup drivers of change. And so, for example, you can see that rumors on social media, that's come under economic changes and also cascading events. So it's something that follows on from the main event. And if you look in detail at these, I'm sure there'll be things that you agree or disagree with about how they work. And that reflects some of the complexities of trying to categorize what people are talking about into these kind of neat boxes. The other thing to note here is that some of the turns have a letter after them, and that's where the turn was repeated in a different round or in a different group, and I'll come back to that idea later on. So we developed these maps for each of the rounds and each of the turns. So one of the other things that we were able to explore is how much people talked about different themes in different rounds. So what I've shown here is a heat map where we have one box for each of the rounds that we conducted, and then each convener corresponds to a column in these, and each row corresponds to one of the themes that we were talking about. So you can see, for example, that critical infrastructure is really commonly discussed in the casualties round, but comes up a lot less frequently in the participants' choice round. And I should say that critical infrastructure and other natural hazards are both further subdivided into different categories as well. You can also see some other variations. So things like people thinking about political breakdown a lot more in the context of financial losses than they were in the context of casualties. Yeah, but equally that the extent of impacts really only came up in the financial round as well. And I think that's because when we think about the extent of impacts code was meant to capture the idea that the effects of this earthquake might go beyond the purely local into a kind of global world, or where it might have been a temporal extent, that it has far-reaching consequences in time as well. And so that was things like people managing somehow to bring down the global financial system on the basis of this earthquake, that kind of impact extent increased by thinking about financial systems. So there's a lot of unpicking that you could do there, but that's just an example to give you an example of the kind of thing that we can do with this. And I just wanted to speak briefly about the turn types, because I mentioned that we did this as a component of deductive coding. What I've shown here on the bar chart in the orange shades are instances where a particular turn type was the only turn type assigned to a turn. And then in blue is where it was also assigned with other turn types. So what we did was we'd ask participants to declare what the turn that they were making was. So you might say, I think that after the earthquake, there will be landslides. That's a cascading event. And then we would go through later and say, okay, that is a cascading event, but is it also, for example, a change in the environmental setting or something like that? And so where these turn types coincide, I've put a heat map on the other side here. And so essentially, if, for example, we have a turn that's coded as both a cascading event and exposure, then that would be plotted in this box here. So it's a bit complicated, but the thing that I want you to take from this is that if we think about the purely hazard component, so the things that we as COMET scientists might generally be interested in here, so for example, the timing of the event, the geographical shifts in its location, directionality, energy release, we can see that these don't really correspond to the main things that people were concerned with. And also that something like timing, for example, almost always corresponds to something else as well. So if we think about, a change in timing, for example, moving the earthquake to the summer, the reason that's a problem is not because the earthquakes happened in summer, but because people anticipate that there'll be more tourists on the beaches in the summer. And so that leads to an increase in exposure. Then I hypothesized at the beginning that repeated turns might be more likely. And so this was a super interesting analysis to me to do, was to look at what turns had people repeated. And the one that came out, and this really surprised me actually, was that the most repeated turn was time relative to a pandemic. And with hindsight, perhaps that shouldn't have been surprising, but at the time I was quite surprised by that. And it must be said that people didn't agree about what time relative to a pandemic would be worse. There were suggestions that it might be worse if such an event were to occur after a pandemic, when lots of tourists were returning to Greece. It might be worse during a pandemic because of other impacts on the health system. It might be worse right at the beginning of the pandemic. In some cases, people were very specific about these questions. But what it does slightly suggest is that the repeated turns don't necessarily represent the things that are most likely. However, I want to talk more about a couple of things that came up in this list in terms of questioning whether we should just dismiss them as being really what's at the forefront of people's minds, or whether they are in fact quite relevant. So the first is that a number of people spoke about the collapse of the Eurozone or wider EU instability. And obviously that seems like a bit of a stretch based on a single earthquake. But this is some analysis that was done by the World Bank for the EU member states in 2021, looking at what they think the government liability would be after an earthquake. And this is looking at the high liability loss scenario. That's a bit complicated. It's to do with what the public expects them to pay, right? There's an amount of money they actually have to pay, and there's an amount of money the public expects them to pay. And so this is in the case where the public expects them to pay a lot, and that's possible. And the parts in blue are the part that's not covered. And then the parts in red, are covered by disaster risk finance instruments. So basically the governments are insured for those bits. And the blue represents what's left over afterwards. And you can see that somewhere like Cyprus, there's really a quite significant percentage of GDP that's not covered by the annual expected losses, for the annual expected losses in earthquakes. And for the EU as a whole, that again, there's a really significant proportion of liability here that's not covered by their current risk financing instruments. And so this is something that the EU is concerned about, which just suggests that although it seems like a big extrapolation, it's something that we ought to be considering and is worthwhile thinking about. The second thing to draw your attention to is that several of the groups spoke about the Suez Canal being impacted by this earthquake. And I said, and specifically the tsunami, and I said that this event happened on the 22nd of March, and the next morning I woke up and the Ever Given was stuck in the Suez Canal. And that has indeed had these far-reaching implications in terms of the impacts on the global supply chains, but it hasn't really been quite as bad as the scenarios that we set up suggested, which means that in a way those could be viewed as downward counterfactuals for the event of a Suez Canal closure. So I just wanted to speak briefly about the kind of ways that people justified the turns that they made. And the most common way that people did this was through using case studies. So through drawing on examples from other disasters. And the most frequently mentioned case studies are those listed here. And you can see that they're mostly things that have either happened in the very recent past, or which are kind of common knowledge disasters, right? Tohoku and the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. And almost all of the 42 unique case studies happened after 2000. And this suggests something again about what the kind of things that people are thinking about are and what they're proposing in their scenarios. And this is just to give an example of people using the case studies as justification, where someone asked a question about whether actually losing the road network really would have an impact in terms of casualties rather than just a purely financial impact. And someone else was able to say, well, actually, yes, it will, because in Haiti, we know that this happened. And this idea that people were saying that turns were plausible on the basis of them having happened before in previous disasters has led us to coin the term counterfactual chimeras. So in Greek mythology, a chimera is a monster composed of the most fearsome parts of other monsters, although the thing on its back is a goat, and I'm still not quite clear why that is scary, but that's fine. And so the idea was that we were generating these scenarios that were considered plausible by combining the worst aspects of other disasters. And I think this raises an important point about how, in a qualitative setting, one should go about assessing what constitutes a plausible scenario and what it actually means for something to be possible or not. So I just wanted to close by talking about a couple of the challenges and positive aspects of this study and what we've kind of found. So I think it's already clear that we're having an issue here with what Kelman et al. Have called tempophilia. So this is the idea that we tend to focus on current events. One participant said, expressed this very nicely by saying, I got blindsided by thinking about the current situation of the world. And we see this both in the justifications in terms of people really concentrating on more recent case studies, and also in terms of those repeated turns, right, that we hypothesize, though we haven't conducted a separate workshop outside the pandemic, that time relative to a pandemic would not have been the most frequently repeated turn had we not been conducting the workshop in March 2021, or had conducted it prior to March 2020 to be more specific. The question really is, what can we do about this? Because if we're interested in exploring the space of kind of unrecognized possibilities, then we really want to get at the things that we know less about rather than focusing more on stuff that is seemingly obvious to everyone. And one suggestion that people have been making is that if we were to do it in future workshops, is to think about only drawing on case studies, say, that happened prior to 2000, just to try and broaden the range and mean that people were drawing more on different experiences there. So there's a question about how we do this, and it also speaks, I think, to the more general problems about how we use the historical record. The other problem, I spent a while at the beginning trying to convince you that disasters aren't natural, and in that sense that centering the hazard might be an error. And this is something that we definitely see happening in the construction of these scenarios. So cascading events, I mentioned, were the most commonly made type of turn. So those are events that follow on from the hazard or follow on from each other. And what that means is that the hazard is viewed as a starting point. And it is a starting point, right, for the exercise. And it's also a starting point in terms of being the point which is connected to the actual history which has occurred. And so the problem with this idea is that it means that it's harder to interrogate the underlying root causes of what is actually going on in these disasters, and therefore to introduce mitigating measures which really address those root causes rather than just providing technological fixes to the hazard. Another troublesome idea was that we wanted to think about qualitative outcomes, and those are very important, and many of the things which emerged you wouldn't easily be able to put a number on. For example, the loss of cultural heritage was something that was widely discussed, and it's not something that can be valued or understood in a way that really is reflected well in numbers. But it does also make it difficult to compare the losses that occur in different scenarios. And I think that's a much more general problem, right? It's not only one for downward counterfactual analysis, but also that what it meant was that in the terms of our workshop, we were often operating at multiple scales. So in the context of the financial round, one participant proposed damage to super yachts as an issue. And that's obviously quite small scale. And then on the other hand, we had things like collapse of the Eurozone. And so it's difficult to know how we should interrogate these scenarios at multiple scales. And there's perhaps something to be said there for being more specific about what it is that you actually want to look into when you're conducting these kind of analyses. And then the other problem, and one which I think is very important in terms of how we think about black swans. Taylor wrote in his 2007 book about black swans that if 9/11 had been anticipated on the 10th of September, then it would not have happened. And I tend to think that that's probably not true. And one of the workshop participants also was kind of speaking about this, that often civil protection authorities and political authorities don't want to hear about worst case scenarios. They want to prepare for manageable events. And I think this speaks to a broader problem, which is that although we might know that these things can occur, how do we convince people or put the social structures in place that allow people to actually be able to respond to these scenarios and to understanding these? And I think this is something that, for example, Ewing and Sinalakis have spoken about in the context of Crete, where they actually conducted an exercise in 2011 called the Great Splash Up, looking at what might happen if there were to be a large tsunami. And there was really relatively little take up because the industry is dependent on, the island is dependent on tourism, right? And so we have to interrogate how those structures are leading people to be creative as vulnerable, and also what would enable people to actually be able to respond to these events. A positive aspect was the use of interdisciplinary groups. And I think this was really cool because people were aware of other people's disciplinary expertise. And so we had some nice examples of people appealing to the people they knew about this stuff in their responses. So an example would be someone saying, oh, I don't know whether the Aswan High Dam might actually be affected by this. And one of the other participants is able to kind of say, oh, well, seismologically speaking, that's pretty far away, probably not going to be a problem. And similarly, that there was a question about whether we were talking about uplifted shorelines on Crete and whether Crete might also go down as a result of similar earthquakes. And again, I'm giving you geological examples. It should be said that people appealed to other kinds of disciplinary expertise as well. But that someone with a geological background was able to say, well, actually, you know, this is a reverse fault, and that's probably how it's going to go. It was also exciting to use interdisciplinary groups because I think, in contrast to what I had expected, perhaps, the repeated turns were perhaps the less interesting ones, and the ones which were one-off are ones which give us genuine insight into things that we hadn't expected. So one of my favorite ones is the idea that social networks report that Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and the president of Greece and the president of Egypt are missing. And that kind of communication or rumor is something that has been very well documented in post-earthquake scenarios. But it was just something that I completely hadn't thought about in how one would respond. And then the other was about failure of early warning systems, but not in the context of, say, evacuation, but rather that businesses might not be able to launch disaster recovery plans and back up their data. And so that was just a very different context for something that I might tend to think about in terms of how I conventionally think about hazards and disasters. So to conclude, if this earthquake does happen in the Mediterranean at the present day, the scenarios that we've built suggest that this really will be a disaster, and we're not the first people to say that. But we are, I think, amongst the first to think about this from a really interdisciplinary perspective, to consider the impacts on a really wide range of different operational mechanisms and things that might go wrong. And so I think that interdisciplinary perspectives and those qualitative risks being included as well is a really important part of this analysis. And yeah, contrary to my views, the common turns don't necessarily show the most likely scenarios, but that doesn't mean that they should be ignored either, that they do highlight some areas of known vulnerability. Crucially, while we're doing this kind of scoping out of ontological spaces and trying to reduce that uncertainty, the kind of thing, the space of things that are beyond the model, the space of things that we haven't considered is effectively infinite, right? There are so many scenarios that could unfold. And what that means is that what we've missed is most likely whatever we would call the next black swan. So before I finish, I just wanted to say that I'll also be at AGU. And so if you want to hear more about this stuff, then you can come to my presentation there. If you're interested much more in what I do from a kind of geophysics perspective, I'll be talking about the rheology of the Tibetan Plateau. And then finally, that I'm involved in an organization called Women Doing Science. And we are currently fundraising for a grant called the Wonder Grant. And this is to support Black and Indigenous women of colour to go from the US to AGU meetings of any sort. And so we're fundraising for that at the moment. And there's a tiny URL here, Wonder-Grant. So if you know anyone who might want to give money to that, or know any organisations that might be willing to, or yourself would like to give small amounts, please do go to that website, and also look out for it at AGU because it will be there too. So I'll end there and ask for any questions.
Thank you so much, Camilla. That was wonderful. If you have any questions, please do put them in the chat, or you can also put them in the Q&A box. I'm monitoring both. We're going to do our best with this Q&A in the same room. But that was brilliant, Camilla. I wanted to ask, just to lead off, we don't have that much time. We're going to have maybe 5 or 10 minutes for questions. So get them in quick if you can. I kind of wanted to ask this downward counterfactual analysis. I believe I got that right. Do you see a place for it in smaller disciplinary areas? So say like PSHA modelers, geophysicists, seismologists, geologists, we all have such different ideas. Do you think that there is worth getting together for those sorts of things, as well as these big interdisciplinary things? Like, how do you want to take this work further? Is it in exploring individual sort of questions in the interdisciplinary area, or taking the method into specific areas?
Yeah, great question. And I think it's really important to recognize that it's hard to think about the worst case scenarios from other disciplines until we've thought about them in our own as well, right? Like, I found it quite useful. And one of the reasons why the Eastern Mediterranean was quite a good place to do this is that people have done a lot of modeling on things like what would the tsunami heights be if we moved it to different locations and things like that, right? So it's quite easy for me as a geophysicist to go in and be like, well, I think it's going to be worse impacts if it's here, and that's how that's going to work out. And so I think there's definitely scope for getting, I guess, smaller cohorts of people in the room, and one, who are in more related disciplines, as well as thinking about that more creative aspect. I would view this kind of scenario planning workshop as opposed to, I think, like downward counterfactual analysis, which you could conduct on your own at a computer if you wanted to do a kind of quantitative one. But I think this kind of workshop can be a really good space for just getting people talking. So one of the things that we discussed a lot in the paper is that the group was interdisciplinary, but it wasn't diverse in the sense of having people, even outside academia. And it also didn't really include stakeholders or people who really know about the local context, and that we expect that it might be a good forum for just getting people to know about what's going on, right? Like that you can just have communication where people do talk about what's the worsening that could happen based on their own disciplinary knowledge. And then that just opens up a conversation where, someone who's in civil protection just isn't aware of, I don't know, what a fisherman might have a problem with, but equally like what a geologist is thinking about what the potential uncertainties are in the paleoseismology associated with an event haven't been thought of by an engineer who's looking at VS30 measurements or something like that. So yeah, I definitely agree.
Thank you so much. The unmuting is very fun. We don't have any other questions. So there was a question, just Payne asked in the Q&A, but she realized that she'd fixed it. She asked what software you use for the coding of the audio transcripts, which was on the slide in the end. But I wonder, sort of on a similar topic, how long did it take? Like if someone were to propose a workshop like this, I think it would be quite interesting to transcribe and then code out similar to what you've been doing to see what sort of things come out. But like, is that quite a big endeavor?
Yes, it is quite a big endeavor. I thought it would be much faster and easier than it was. And the reason why I've left this cartoon on the last slide is that I'm told by my co-authors that this doesn't epitomize my my attitude, and I hope it doesn't, but that definitely I kind of thought that this was quite easy, right? Because you're just selecting the ideas that people have come up with, and so you should just be able to just kind of put them down. And I didn't fully understand about the implications of stuff like deciding, you know, which sections of the text you should actually be coding, for example. And there's a whole literature devoted to how you should do this properly. And the thing I would say, if people want to do it, is really to talk to people who've done it before, obviously, but also to work to try and really understand what it is that you want to do and get from it before you are doing it. And I suppose that one thing that really struck me was that whereas say you use some seismological data, right, and you do some analysis on it, and at the end of it you're like, oh, this wasn't a good way of doing this data. I've done this wrong. I'll re-download the files from Wilbur 3 and I'll go through the whole process again. And that's fine. But you can't really unread the transcripts, right? And so in the context of this kind of data, it's really important, even more so than it would be in geophysical settings, to have an idea of what you want to do with it beforehand and to have pre-specified those things, right? Because by the time you've already assigned your labels to arbitrary blocks, it's way too late to go back and say, actually, we're coding on a sentence level, you know, like we're doing this sentence by sentence. And so I think that's really important. In a literal sense, how much time did it take? I would say that we had, in comparison to most studies, a lot less data. So we have about 12.5 hours of transcripts. And it took us about 6 months or something like that. But that was, some of that was just maybe like 2 months of me full-time doing it, and then smaller amounts of other people's time. But for people, like, it's people's whole PhDs, right? Like it's not a small thing to do. Yeah, especially if you have lots of transcripts.
No, that's actually very useful. I was sort of thinking, yeah, this is a great thing to do for, say, PSHA meetings where none of us are really coming from the same sort of place. And there is a lot of misunderstanding, but yeah, I think it would take a whole PhD to come into those meetings and figure it out. That makes sense. Okay, well, we do have some Q&As. Let me just check. So Svenja Cartons has said, thanks for the great talk. Do you think the downward counterfactual analysis would also make sense for extensive risk? So low severity, high frequency, which are more impacted by underlying risk drivers, or is this method only applied for intensive risks and black swan events?
Thank you for that, Svenja. I think that the utility of it is in understanding things that we don't normally include in our models. So it's about thinking about how things might have been worse, right? And so that could also work in terms of low severity, high frequency events. If you have a situation where one occurs and, I don't know, it's bad in a particular way, but you want to think about how it might have been worse. So what could you do for next time to decrease the severity further? And I think in that sense, downward counterfactuals would be a useful thing to do, because you can explore, yeah, exactly what might have happened had that event evolved differently. So the low frequency component isn't a key aspect of it. You could imagine, you know, using it, and I suppose one of the reasons where this kind of idea has been used for a long time, right, is near miss analysis in industrial accidents and things like that, where rather than only looking at the disasters that actually happened, that there's a requirement to report on the things that nearly happened. And so, yeah, in that sense, you could use it for extensive risks as well, I think.
Cool. We have a few more questions and also one hand up. Elliot Klein, you've got your hand up. If you have a question, maybe you can type it in. Otherwise, maybe we can invite you to speak as well. This question comes from Umberto Francasi. Thanks a lot for the excellent talk, Camilla. One, if slightly obvious issue that comes to mind is that unprecedented, which is physically very much motivated, of course, does, however, inconsistent with the fact that the overlay among population levels, land cover, resource exploitation, and added hidden vulnerabilities do in fact accrue and may turn up in setting an unprecedented backdrop. If not hazard towards risk, does this sound realistic?
Yeah, and thanks, Humberto. I think you're completely right. It's not the case that these disasters literally have a historical precedent in the sense of being the same as one that happened before. And I think that the real nuance in how one uses the historical record, and what I hope that downward counterfactual analysis goes some way towards, is the idea, I suppose, of drawing out what the generalities are, what the things that we might learn from are, rather than saying that we need to prepare for the specific event that happening again. So for example, in an area where population levels have increased massively since a previous disaster, that we learn from the ways in which that disaster unfolded and apply them to the context we're now looking at, but that we don't say, oh, we assume this will be the same. And I think Ewing and Singalakis talked about this in their 2011 paper, where they were actually thinking about tsunamis, right? And they're saying that what people are planning for are often run-ups of the same height as the previous time that the similar tsunami occurred. And now with sea level rise, for example, that might be a completely not a reflection of the likely inundation that we see on land. And so in a sense, that inundation will be unprecedented, but it's not that it's impossible for us to model it, right? We just need to have actually thought about that and accounted for it. And so I guess it's just that nuance in how you choose to use the historical record. And also, I suppose, not using the idea that something's unprecedented as an excuse for not preparing for it, when it could well be foreseeable, even if it hasn't happened in exactly the same way before.
Awesome, thank you. 2 more questions. Jacqueline Houghton has asked, how much information was given to the participants about the area and earthquake, and how much did you assume they already knew?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So we did a number of briefings and prepared a briefing document for them. There was no requirement for them to know anything. And actually, we wanted to be quite specific that we wanted them to bring what their expertise was, rather than being overly concerned about whether or not they had specific expertise. And this was particularly the case for people who come from social science backgrounds, where there's a real recognition that the precise nuances of the circumstances you're working in have a massive impact on what the outcomes are, right? And so there was a bit of a worry that people would come and say, well, I don't know anything about Crete, so how can I draw any kind of inferences from any of my knowledge? And so what we did give them was a briefing document which just summarized in sort of layperson's terms, or like in a broad sense, what the tectonics of the region were, just in terms of like, there's convergence here, it's a subduction zone, we think that the faulting's a bit like this, this was the magnitude of the earthquake, this is where it happened. I got told off for trying to go into some of the geophysical debates about what the magnitude was and stuff like that. So we reduced it so that people would be able to understand it from any of their backgrounds. And then we gave them links in the briefing document also to where they might find some useful data sets. So there's quite a lot of information about various things like, where oil pipelines are in the Eastern Mediterranean and things like that. But we asked them really in the exercise to note down where they would have liked additional information, rather than to kind of try and look it up in real time, because we just didn't have enough time in the course of the workshop to really do that. So we gave them, to summarize, we gave them a briefing on it, but we didn't give them a really detailed, or require them to have a really detailed knowledge of what was going on in the area.
Cool. And Eric Kai has asked, great talk, Camilla, can this method be made operational everywhere, or is it mostly a way to foster communication between experimental and social sciences?
Thanks, Eric. I think it can be made operational in a lot of different contexts. So the specific thing I've been exploring here is obviously this idea of using qualitative data, but I think that there's a lot of scope for using it also in a purely quantitative sense, right? To just ask what happens, for example, in the idea that I gave about the example I gave about Singapore, where they've literally just said, okay, here's a fault. Let's say we have a magnitude 5 earthquake that happens, according to all the scaling laws we know, and what do we anticipate the peak ground accelerations are? Let's take a map of VS30 and move it around and see what happens, right? And we know that we can have interplate earthquakes, so it's plausible that we might have one somewhere. And so I think that it has scope in multiple senses, right? So it both has an opportunity at one level to kind of just be a forum for discussion, or even for education, right? For people to think about different ways of thinking about a particular type of disaster. But it also has more specific modeling applications. And so if you were interested in one specific question, like what might the ground shaking have been in Haiti, for example, had it happened in the area between the earthquake in 2010 and 2021 or something like that, then one could also apply similar analyses and think about that in the kind of quantitative sense in which this was originally proposed.
Awesome. That's all the questions that we have. And I think given we're 10 minutes over time, I think that we will give you a break now. So thank you so much, Camilla. Thank you so much for agreeing to give this talk. It was wonderful. It was really interesting. And there's a lot of good feedback coming in through the crowd. A reminder that this has been recorded and it will go up online. We'll put some of Camilla's contact details in there just in case you have any follow-up questions or interest and want to get in touch. But thank you so much. And I will unmute.
Thank you very much, Tamara.
Wonderful. Thanks everybody for coming. We will see you again in January for our next COMET webinar. I hope you have the best holiday period and bye for now.